I remember the first time I felt the Titan's heartbeat through the soles of my boots, a rhythmic thunder that seemed to shake the very marrow from my bones. I was 17 standard years old, freshly conscripted from the lower hive manufactorums where I had spent my childhood assembling circuit boards in the dim glow of sodium lamps, my fingers stained with solder and my lungs already thick with the taste of recycled air. The day they came for me, tech adepts in crimson robes marked with the cogtooth symbol of the Mechanicus, I thought perhaps I had been selected for some punishment, some infraction I could not remember committing in the endless blur of 12-hour shifts and protein-paced meals. My mother had wept, clutching at my threadbare work coveralls, but the adepts had simply pushed her aside with their servo arms, their augmetic eyes clicking and whirring as they scanned my identification tattooed across my neck. I was told I should be grateful, that I had been chosen for a holy purpose, that I would walk in the shadow of a god. They did not tell me that I would never see natural light again, that the god in question was a machine of such terrible majesty that even looking upon it through the observation ports would leave me feeling hollowed out and insignificant, a single cell in a body so vast I could not comprehend its totality. The transport that carried me from the Hive City to the Forge complex was a windowless cargo hauler, packed with 24 other conscripts, all of us silent with fear and confusion, the smell of our collective sweat mixing with the acrid scent of promethium exhaust that leaked through the ventilation grills. We traveled for what might have been days or weeks' time, loses meaning when you cannot see the sun, when the only markers of its passage are the meal dispensers clicking open at irregular intervals, dropping ration bars that tasted of sawdust and chemical preservatives into our trembling hands. Some of the others whispered prayers to the God Emperor, their voices barely audible over the grinding of the transport's engines. I did not pray. I had learned long ago in the manufactorum that the Emperor had little time for the likes of us, that our purpose was to serve and die without complaint, and that faith was a luxury afforded to those who did not spend their days breathing metal dust and machine oil. When we finally arrived, the loading ramp dropped with a pneumatic hiss, and we were herded out into a space so enormous that I felt my stomach drop, as though I were falling even though my feet remained planted on the deck plating. The Forge complex was a cathedral to industry, its ceiling lost in shadows and smoke hundreds of meters above us, its walls lined with gantries and walkways that stretched into the darkness like the ribs of some immense beast. The air was thick with heat, a suffocating blanket that made sweat spring immediately to my skin, and the noise was something alive, a constant assault of hammering, grinding, the screech of metal on metal, the deep bass rumble of furnaces that I could feel in my chest. Servitors moved among the machinery like ghosts, their human parts rotted and withered, their mechanical components clanking and hissing, their faces, those that still had faces, slack and empty of anything resembling thought or emotion. I watched one lumber past, dragging a massive wrench behind it, and I saw that where its eyes should have been there were only dark sockets fitted with crude optical sensors that glowed a dull red. That was when I first understood that this place did not recognize us as human, that we were components, tools to be used, until we broke and then discarded or recycled into something more useful. The tech priest who greeted us was more machine than man, his lower body replaced entirely by a tracked locomotion unit, his arms a mess of mechadendrites and surgical implements that writhed and coiled like serpents. When he spoke, his voice emerged from a vox grill set into his throat, flat and emotionless, each word clipped and precise. He told us we had been selected for training as Titan crew, that we would serve aboard one of the Omnissiah's sacred war machines, that our lives now belonged to the machine god and the Imperium, that we should consider ourselves blessed beyond measure. He did not smile when he said this. I do not think his face was capable of expression anymore, but there was something in the mechanical rasp of his voice that suggested satisfaction, or perhaps merely the completion of a routine subroutine. We were led through the complex, down corridors that seemed to stretch for kilometers, past assembly bays where I glimpsed the legs of Titans under construction, each foot the size of a hab block, each ankle joint a massive piston assembly wreathed in coolant mist. The scale of it was overwhelming, incomprehensible. I had known the Imperium built war machines. Of course, everyone knew that, but seeing them, being in their presence, understanding that I would somehow be expected to operate one of these divine engines, it made my legs weak and my vision swim with vertigo. Our training began immediately, without rest or time to acclimate. We were stripped of our hive clothing and issued crew jumpsuits. Heavy canvas affairs dyed a deep burgundy and stamped with purity seals and machine blessings. The fabric was rough against my skin, stiff with some chemical treatment that made it resistant to fire and acid, and it smelled of incense and industrial lubricant. We were given identification chips that were embedded into our wrists with a pneumatic injector, the pain sharp and immediate, a white-hot spike that made me gasp and bite down on my tongue hard enough to taste blood. The chip would track our location within the forge complex, would grant us access to certain areas and deny us others, would monitor our vital signs and report any deviation from acceptable parameters to the overseers. We were told that attempting to remove the chip would result in immediate termination, not dismissal from service, but actual termination, execution. Our bodies rendered down into raw materials for the servitor vats. No one asked questions. No one dared. The training itself was brutal and unrelenting, a regimen designed to break down whatever we had been before and rebuild us into something fit for service aboard a god machine. We were taught the litanies of activation, long strings of high Gothic and binaric cant that had to be memorized perfectly, each syllable pronounced with exact precision or risk, invoking the machine spirit's displeasure. We spent hours in training cogitators, our minds plugged into simulation systems that forced us to navigate the Titan's interior layout over and over until we could move through its corridors blindfolded, until we knew the location of every emergency bulkhead, every weapons relay, every plasma conduit. The simulations were punishing, filled with scenarios of catastrophic failure, plasma leaks that flooded compartments with radiation, coolant explosions that flash froze entire sections, reactor breaches that would kill us in seconds. We died over and over in those simulations, felt the phantom pain of being burned alive or crushed or suffocated, and each time we were revived and forced to run through it again, to learn from our mistakes, to understand that our survival was always secondary to the Titan's operational status. Physical conditioning was equally merciless. We ran through obstacle courses in full pressure suits, the heavy equipment making every movement exhausting, our breath coming in ragged gasps inside the sealed helmets. We practiced emergency repairs while suspended from harnesses in zero-gravity chambers, our hands encased in thick gloves as we tried to manipulate delicate components, our instructors screaming at us over the vox when we fumbled or dropped a tool. We learned to function in extreme temperatures, spending hours in furnace chambers where the heat was so intense that our sweat evaporated before it could soak into our jumpsuits, then being thrown immediately into cryo chambers where the cold bit through every layer of clothing and made our joints stiffen and ache. We learned to fight fires in confined spaces, to seal breaches in the hull, to perform field amputations on injured crew members using nothing but a plasma cutter and a prayer to the Omnissiah. 3 of my training cohort died in the first month, 1 from heart failure during a high-G centrifuge test, 1 from a fall in the zero-gravity chamber when his harness failed, 1 from infection after a training injury went septic. Their bodies were removed without ceremony, and the next morning we found their names scratched from the training roster, replaced by new recruits pulled from other hive cities, other manufactorums, all of them wearing the same expression of confusion and fear that I had worn when I first arrived. I learned to hate the forge complex with a passion that burned hotter than its furnaces. Every surface was metal, cold and unyielding, and the constant noise never stopped, not even during the designated sleep periods when we were locked in our barracks, long chambers lined with narrow bunks, stacked 4 high, the air stale and recycled, the lighting a dim red that made it impossible to truly rest. The food was nutrient paste, dispensed from wall-mounted units, grey slop that had no taste beyond a faint chemical sweetness, fortified with vitamins and stimulants designed to keep us functional through the endless training cycles. We ate in silence, too exhausted to speak, and I remember thinking that this must be what it felt like to be processed, to be ground down into something uniform and compliant. My hands, once nimble from years of circuit board assembly, became thick with calluses from handling tools and equipment. My back developed a permanent ache from the weight of the pressure suits. My hearing began to fade, the constant exposure to machinery and alarms leaving a persistent ringing in my ears that I could not escape even in the rare moments of quiet. But worse than the physical degradation was the slow erosion of my sense of self. We were not allowed personal possessions, not permitted to form friendships or attachments. The instructors discouraged any conversation that was not directly related to our duties, and I quickly learned that showing concern for another trainee's well-being was grounds for punishment. Hours spent in isolation cells, or assigned to the worst work details, scrubbing out the reactor cooling vents or processing waste from the servitor maintenance bays. We were given numbers instead of names during training exercises, and I found myself responding automatically to my designation, forgetting sometimes what my mother had called me, struggling to remember the sound of her voice, or the layout of the small hab unit where I had grown up. The forge complex became my entire world, its routines and rituals the only structure I knew, and I could feel myself becoming hollow, a shell filled with technical specifications and emergency procedures, but empty of anything that might have once been called human. 6 months into training, we were finally deemed ready to meet our Titan. The day began like any other, the harsh blare of the wake-up klaxon, the rush to the ablution stations where we washed in cold water that smelled of rust and chlorine, the morning meal of protein paste and recaf so bitter it made my teeth ache. But then, instead of being marched to the training halls, we were led deeper into the forge complex, down into levels I had never seen, through checkpoints where armed servitors scanned our identification chips and heavy blast doors cycled open with the groan of hydraulics. The air grew warmer, thicker, and I could hear something massive moving in the distance, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to come up through the deck plates. My heart hammered in my chest, fear and anticipation mixing into something that made my hands shake and my mouth go dry. When we finally entered the main assembly bay, I stopped breathing for a moment, my brain struggling to process what my eyes were seeing. The Titan towered above us, a colossus of adamantium and ceramite that rose so high I had to crane my neck back until it hurt just to see the top of its head. It was a warlord class, I would learn later, one of the largest patterns of battle Titan, standing nearly 50 meters tall, bristling with weapons that could level cities. Its armor was painted in the livery of its legio, deep crimson trimmed with black and gold, marked with skulls and high Gothic script proclaiming its dedication to the God Emperor and the Machine God. Its head was a cathedral in miniature, Gothic arches and flying buttresses, eyes like burning coals that stared down at us with what I could only describe as contempt. Incense burners hung from its limbs, filling the air with acrid smoke, and I could see tech priests swarming over its surface like ants, performing the endless rituals of maintenance and appeasement that kept such machines functional. The Princeps, the Titan's commander, came to address us in person. He descended from the Titan's bridge in a lifting platform, and when he stepped onto the deck, I saw that he was connected to the machine by thick cables that ran from sockets in his spine, disappearing back up into the Titan's body like umbilical cords. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes had the glassy look of someone who spent more time interfaced with the machine than existing in his own flesh. He moved stiffly, as though his body was unfamiliar to him, and when he spoke, his voice had an odd echo to it, as though the Titan itself was speaking through him. He told us that we were to be the crew of this holy engine, that our minds and souls would be bound to it, that we would know no greater honor than to serve as its blood and sinew. He told us that the Titan's name was Mortis Unbound, that it had walked in the Emperor's service for 10,000 years, that it had crushed heretics and Xenos beneath its feet across 100 worlds. He told us that many would die in its service, that our lives were nothing compared to the Titan's holy mission, that we should embrace our fate with gratitude and devotion. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn and flee back through the blast doors, back up through the levels of the Forge complex, back to the Hive City where at least my servitude had been comprehensible, limited to the scale of human architecture and human understanding. But there was nowhere to run. The servitors at the exits had their weapons trained on us, and I knew without being told that any attempt to escape would end with my corpse being dragged to the rendering vats. So I stood there, my legs trembling, and I looked up at Mortis Unbound, and I understood that my life had ended the day the tech adepts came for me, that everything after was merely a slow process of dying by degrees. Our assignment to specific roles within the crew was conducted through a series of neural aptitude tests, our brains scanned and analyzed by machines that determined where we would be most useful to the Titan. I was designated for the reactor maintenance crew, a position that filled me with cold dread because I knew what it meant. The Titan's plasma reactor was its heart, a barely contained star that provided the immense power needed to move such a massive machine and fire its world-ending weapons, and maintaining it meant working in conditions that would kill most men within minutes. The reactor crew had the highest attrition rate of any position aboard the Titan, their bodies burned out by radiation exposure, their cells breaking down at the molecular level until they either died or were so damaged that they were dragged away to be converted into servitors, their ruined flesh augmented with machinery to squeeze out a few more years of service. My first shift in the reactor chamber was a descent into hell. The chamber itself was located deep in the Titan's body, accessible only through a series of narrow crawlways and maintenance shafts, where the temperature climbed with every meter we descended. We worked in teams of 4, each of us encased in radiation suits so thick and cumbersome that movement was exhausting, every step a battle against the weight of the lead-lined material. The suits were old, patched and repatched, the seals around the helmets cracked and degraded, offering only minimal protection against the radiation that permeated every molecule of air in the reactor chamber. We carried dosimeter badges that clicked continuously, the sound accelerating to a frantic chattering as we approached the reactor core, a warning that we were absorbing rads at a rate that would reduce our lifespan by years for every hour of work. The reactor itself was beautiful in a terrible way, a massive sphere of containment fields and magnetic coils that glowed with an inner light so intense it hurt to look at even through the tinted visor of my helmet. The heat was unbearable, a physical force that made sweat pour down my face and soak into the padding of the suit, where it boiled against my skin and left burns that would ache for days. The noise was a constant roar, the sound of barely controlled fusion, punctuated by the clang of cooling pumps and the hiss of emergency vents cycling superheated plasma out into heat sinks. We moved through this hell with practiced efficiency, checking pressure readings, adjusting magnetic field generators, replacing burned-out components that glowed white-hot even through our insulated gloves. Every task was performed according to strict ritual, each action accompanied by the appropriate prayer to the machine god, because to deviate from the holy procedures was to risk the reactor's wrath, to invite catastrophic failure that would consume the Titan and everyone within it. I learned to function in a state of constant pain and fear. The radiation sickness began within days, nausea that made it difficult to keep down even the tasteless nutrient paste, headaches that felt like spikes driven through my temples, weakness that made climbing back up the maintenance shafts an ordeal that left me gasping and trembling. My hair began to fall out in clumps, clogging the drains in the ablution stations. My gums bled when I brushed my teeth, the tissue breaking down, exposing the roots. I developed sores on my skin that refused to heal, weeping clear fluid that stained my jumpsuit. The medical servitors in the infirmary dispensed radiation medication pills that tasted of chalk and did nothing to stop the cellular damage, only slowing it slightly, buying time measured in months rather than years. I knew I was dying, that every shift in the reactor chamber was bringing me closer to the moment when my body would simply give up, when I would collapse in the heat and radiation and be dragged out like so many others before me, another casualty in the endless war to keep the Titan operational. But even as I felt myself deteriorating, I began to understand the Titan in a way that transcended my horror and despair. When the reactor was fully powered and the Titan was prepared for deployment, I could feel its presence in my bones, a vibration that seemed to resonate with something deep inside me. The tech priest spoke of the machine spirit, the animating intelligence that dwelled within the Titan, and I had dismissed it as religious nonsense, mechanical superstition. But there were moments, deep in the reactor chamber, when I could swear I felt something watching me, something vast and ancient and utterly alien. The Titan was alive in a way that defied explanation, its consciousness woven into the machinery itself, and we crew members were merely blood cells flowing through its body, keeping it functional, expendable, and ultimately irrelevant to its true purpose. The Titan's first deployment after I joined the crew was against a heretic uprising on a planet whose name I never learned. We were loaded into the massive transport ship along with hundreds of other war machines, tanks, artillery pieces, entire regiments of infantry, and I spent the weeks of warp travel in my cramped bunk, listening to the ship groan and shudder around us, feeling sick with more than just radiation poisoning as the warp currents buffeted us through the Imperium. The other crew members did not speak of what was to come, maintaining the same silence they had kept since training, each of us locked in our own private anticipation of the violence we were being sent to inflict. I tried to imagine what it would be like, tried to prepare myself mentally, but nothing could have readied me for the reality of war on the scale at which Titans operated. We made planetfall in a drop fortress, a massive lander that hit the surface hard enough to rattle my teeth in my skull, and then the Titan was activated with rituals that took hours, tech priests chanting prayers, while we crew members rushed through our pre-deployment checks, ensuring every system was functional, every weapon loaded, every reactor parameter within acceptable limits. When Mortis Unbound finally took its first step, the entire interior shook with the impact, a bass note so deep I felt it in my chest cavity, and I was thrown against the bulkhead hard enough to see stars. The reactor surged to full power, the heat in the chamber climbing so high that even with the cooling systems at maximum, the temperature gauges redlined, and I worked frantically with my team to keep the containment field stable, to prevent a breach that would vaporize us and cripple the Titan. Through the Vox network, I could hear the Princeps issuing commands, his voice distorted by the neural interface that bound him to the Titan, and I could hear the responses from the weapons crews, the confirmation that the volcano cannons were armed, that the turbo-laser destructors were tracking targets, that the missile batteries were ready to fire. And then the first shot was fired, and the entire Titan recoiled with the force of it, the structural members groaning under the stress, and I heard through the Vox the screams of men dying as the volcano cannon's plasma bolt struck whatever target the Princeps had selected, saw on the reactor monitors the massive power draw as the weapon recharged for another shot. The noise was indescribable, a constant thunder of weapons fire that made my already damaged ears ring with pain, and the Titan moved with a lumbering grace that was somehow terrible in its inevitability, each step crushing whatever lay beneath its massive feet, buildings, vehicles, people. It made no difference. We fought for 3 days without rest. The Titan's reactor pushed to the absolute limits of its capacity, and in the reactor chamber we worked shifts that blurred together into one continuous ordeal of heat and radiation and desperate maintenance. My hands were burned so badly that the flesh came away in strips when I removed my gloves. The synthetic material fused to my skin. My lungs felt as though they were filled with ground glass, each breath a labor. My vision swam with strange lights that had nothing to do with the reactor's glow, visual artifacts caused by radiation damage to my optic nerves. But I continued to work, because there was no alternative, because to fail was to doom the Titan and everyone aboard it, because I had been trained too well to do anything but follow my conditioning, even as my body betrayed me. The heretics, whoever they were, died in numbers I could not comprehend. Through status reports that filtered down through the command structure, I learned that Mortis Unbound had destroyed an entire city, that its weapons had reduced habitation blocks to molten slag, that it had crushed armored columns beneath its feet and scattered infantry formations with storms of missile fire. The Princeps, when he addressed the crew after the battle, spoke of a glorious victory for the Emperor, of heretics purged, and the Imperium's wrath made manifest. He did not mention the casualties among the Titan crew, 7 dead from various accidents and equipment failures, another 12 so severely injured they would never serve again. He did not mention the cities full of people who had probably never heard of the heresy we were suppressing, who had died simply because they were in the path of the Titan's march. In the reactor chamber, scrubbing away the carbon scoring from emergency vents, I thought about those people and felt nothing. Whatever part of me that might have felt horror or sympathy had been burned away along with everything else. We were deployed again within a month, and then again, and again, until the campaigns blurred together into an endless cycle of violence. Each deployment followed the same pattern, the rituals of activation, the terror of the first moments when the Titan lurched into motion, the desperate scramble to keep the reactor stable, as weapons fire and return fire shook the entire structure. The aftermath, when we assessed damage and made repairs and counted the dead. I became intimately familiar with every meter of the reactor chamber, knew where the radiation hotspots were, which panels were safe to touch with bare hands, and which would flash burn flesh in seconds. I learned to read the reactor's moods, to sense when the plasma containment was becoming unstable, to predict when a cooling pump was about to fail based on subtle changes in its operational rhythm. It was not skill born from training but from necessity, from spending so many hours in proximity to the machine that it became an extension of my own nervous system. The other members of my reactor team died one by one, replaced by new crew members who lasted weeks or months before they too succumbed to radiation sickness or accidents, or simply gave up and stopped following safety procedures, choosing a quick death over the slow dissolution we all faced. I became the senior reactor technician by virtue of survival rather than merit, tasked with training replacements even as my own body failed. My hair never grew back, leaving my scalp a patchwork of scar tissue and radiation burns. My teeth loosened in my gums until I could pull them out with my fingers, leaving gaps that made eating even more difficult. My bones became brittle, prone to fracturing from the slightest impact, and I developed a persistent cough that brought up blood and fragments of tissue that I did not want to examine too closely. The pain became my constant companion, a dull ache that permeated every cell, punctuated by sharp spikes when I moved wrong or exerted myself. The medical servitors continued to dispense radiation medication, but the doses were insufficient, rationed to keep us functional rather than actually healthy. I began to understand that we were being deliberately maintained at the edge of death, kept alive just long enough to be useful, our bodies wrung out for every last bit of service before being discarded. It was efficient, I suppose. From the Mechanicus's perspective, why waste resources on full treatment when replacement crew were abundant, when there were always more conscripts being pulled from hive cities and manufactorums to feed into the machine? The thought should have filled me with rage, but I found I had no rage left, only a kind of hollow acceptance that this was my purpose, that I existed to serve the Titan until I could serve no longer. 3 years into my service, I began to experience something the tech priests called communion sickness. It happened during a particularly intense battle. The Titan engaged against Xeno's war machines that fired weapons I did not understand, energy beams that bypassed our void shields and burned through armor plating, forcing us to route emergency power to the shields and push the reactor beyond its safe operating parameters. I was elbow-deep in a plasma relay, trying to replace a burned-out regulator, when I felt something shift inside my head, a sensation like falling even though I was braced against the bulkhead. For a moment I was not in the reactor chamber but somewhere else, somewhere vast and dark and filled with rage, and I understood that I was feeling what the Titan felt, that somehow the neural interface network that connected the princeps to the machine had leaked into my consciousness, had pulled me partially into the Titan's awareness. It was terrifying beyond description, like standing at the edge of an infinite abyss and feeling it pull at you, threatening to swallow you whole. The Titan's mind, if it could be called that, was alien and immense, a thing of pure instinct and programmed purpose, driven by the accumulated hatred of 10,000 years of warfare. It did not think in any way I could understand, but rather existed as a kind of living will, a force that shaped reality around it through sheer presence. I felt its hunger for battle, its satisfaction at the destruction it wrought, its contempt for the fragile organic components that scurried through its interior. And I felt something else, something deeper and more disturbing. I felt that the Titan was aware of me, that it saw me as I saw it, and that it found me wanting, barely worth the energy required to acknowledge my existence. The communion broke after what might have been seconds or hours' time had lost meaning, and I found myself on the deck plating, my nose bleeding, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The other reactor crew members were staring at me with expressions that mixed fear and pity, and I knew that what had happened to me was not unique, that others had experienced similar episodes, and that it marked the beginning of the end. Communion sickness was a sign of neurological damage, the tech priests explained later, caused by long-term exposure to the Titan's neural network, a degradation of the barriers that kept our individual consciousness separate from the machine's vast presence. It would get worse, they said, the episodes becoming more frequent and longer, until eventually my mind would be subsumed entirely, my personality dissolving into static and machine code, my body kept alive by augmetics, while my consciousness drowned in the Titan's overwhelming presence. I should have been terrified, but instead I felt something almost like relief. The thought of simply ceasing to exist, of being absorbed into something larger than myself, held a strange appeal after years of pain and fear and loneliness. To become part of the Titan, to lose my individual awareness in exchange for becoming a fragment of something eternal and powerful, seemed almost like salvation compared to the slow decay I was experiencing. But the communion episodes were unpredictable and disorienting, pulling me out of my body at random moments, leaving me vulnerable to accidents in the already hazardous reactor chamber. I began to dread them even as I felt myself drawn toward them, a contradiction that left me feeling unmoored from reality. The Titan sustained major damage during a battle against orc war machines on a planet dominated by toxic jungles and acid rain. An orc gargant, a towering scrap metal monstrosity animated by psychic resonance and sheer belligerence, managed to close with us before the princeps could maintain optimal firing distance, and its crude but massive weapons tore through our void shields and gouged wounds in our armor plating. One shot, a crude rocket larger than a hab block, struck us in the torso section, the explosion tearing open the hull and sending shrapnel scything through the interior compartments. The reactor chamber was spared direct damage, but the structural shock was so severe that support members failed, sending a coolant pipe assembly crashing down across the main accessway, and the sudden pressure drop in the cooling system caused the plasma containment fields to fluctuate wildly. We fought to stabilize the reactor even as the Titan continued to move and fight, the Princeps refusing to disengage despite the critical damage we had sustained. My team worked in a frenzy, bypassing damaged systems, rerouting coolant flow through auxiliary lines, manually adjusting magnetic field generators that should have been controlled by automated systems that had failed. The heat climbed to levels I had never experienced, the temperature inside my radiation suit exceeding the design tolerances, and I could feel my skin blistering beneath the layers of protective material, could smell the acrid scent of burning flesh and synthetic fabrics. One of my team members, a young woman who had been with us for only 2 months, made a mistake, reached for a control panel that had become energized by a short circuit, and the electricity arced through her body with a sound like tearing silk, stopping her heart instantly. She fell without a sound, her body rigid, smoke rising from the contact points where the current had entered and exited her body. We did not stop to remove her corpse or say prayers. We could not afford to. The reactor was seconds away from breach, and if the containment failed, we would all die, along with everyone else aboard the Titan. I felt the communion sickness pulling at me, trying to drag me into the Titan's awareness at the worst possible moment, and I fought it with everything I had left, focusing on the physical task before me, on the specific sequence of actions required to bring the reactor back under control. My hands moved on autopilot, following procedures drilled into me through years of repetition, and somehow, impossibly, we managed to stabilize the containment fields, managed to bring the temperature back down to merely dangerous rather than catastrophic levels. The Titan killed the Orc Gargant with a sustained barrage from its volcano cannons, reducing the enemy machine to slag and scrap, and then limped back to the forward operating base for repairs that would take weeks. The damage assessment revealed how close we had come to total failure, multiple hull breaches, structural members cracked and twisted, entire weapon systems offline, the plasma reactor operating at only 70% capacity due to damage we could not fully repair with the resources available. The crew casualties were severe, 19 dead, 32 injured seriously enough to require evacuation to a proper medical facility. The woman who had died in the reactor chamber was taken away along with the others, and her name was added to the long list of crew members who had served and fallen, a list that stretched back thousands of years, engraved on a memorial plaque in the Titan's bridge that I had never seen and never would. We remained at the forward base for 2 months, undergoing repairs and taking on replacement crew, and during that time I experienced communion sickness episodes with increasing frequency, sometimes several times a day, each one leaving me disoriented and exhausted. The tech priests examined me, ran tests with their machines, and concluded that my neural pathways had been irreversibly damaged by the combination of radiation exposure and proximity to the Titan's systems. They gave me a choice, or what they called a choice. I could continue serving in the reactor crew until I died or became completely incapacitated, or I could volunteer for augmentation, have portions of my brain replaced with mechanical components that would allow me to interface more directly with the Titan's systems while also preventing the complete dissolution of my consciousness. I agreed to the augmentation because the alternative was simply waiting to die, and I had discovered that even in my degraded state I still possessed enough self-preservation instinct to want to delay that moment as long as possible. The surgery was performed in a decay bay that smelled of disinfectant and ozone, carried out by tech priests who worked with the cold efficiency of men repairing a machine rather than operating on a human patient. They drilled ports into my skull, threaded neural cables through my brain tissue, replaced damaged sections with augmetic components that would never tire or fail from radiation damage. The pain was extraordinary, a white-hot agony that even the strongest anesthetics could not completely suppress. and I floated in and out of consciousness for days afterward, hallucinating conversations with people who were long dead, reliving memories that felt more real than the surgical recovery chamber where my body lay broken and reconfigured. When I finally recovered enough to return to duty, I discovered that the augmentation had changed me in ways I had not anticipated. The communion sickness episodes had stopped, replaced by a constant low-level awareness of the Titan's presence, as though I could feel it breathing in the back of my mind, its thoughts, if they could be called thoughts, brushing against my consciousness like whispers in a language I could almost but not quite understand. The pain from my radiation-damaged body remained, but it felt more distant now, as though it belonged to someone else, a problem that my organic components were experiencing but which did not truly affect the core of what I was. I worked more efficiently, my augmented reflexes and cognitive processing allowing me to anticipate problems and respond to emergencies with inhuman speed and precision. But I also felt myself becoming less human with each passing day, my emotional responses dampening, my memories of life, before the Titan fading into a haze of irrelevance. The other crew members began to treat me differently, with a mixture of respect and unease that bordered on fear. I had crossed a threshold that they had not yet reached, become something that was no longer quite one of them, and they understood instinctively that I represented their own potential future, the transformation from human being into something that existed only to serve the machine. I tried to maintain some connection to my humanity, but it became increasingly difficult to remember why it mattered, why I should care about preserving an identity that had brought me nothing but suffering. The Titan's presence in my mind grew stronger, more insistent, and I began to understand that the augmentation had not saved me, but rather accelerated the process it was meant to prevent, that I was being slowly absorbed into the machine, just as the tech priests had warned would happen. We were deployed to a war zone where the fighting had ground into a stalemate, two massive armies locked in trench warfare across a blasted landscape of churned earth and shattered fortifications. The Titan was used as an assault breaker, sent forward to crush enemy strongpoints and break their defensive lines, and we spent weeks in constant combat, the reactor running at maximum capacity, my augmented mind processing the stream of data from sensors and monitoring systems with mechanical efficiency. The communion became deeper, more complete, until I could no longer tell where my thoughts ended and the Titan's machine intelligence began. I felt the impact of enemy fire against our armor as though it were striking my own skin, felt the satisfaction of destroying enemy targets as though I were crushing them with my own hands, felt the Titan's contempt for the enemy and its pride in its own terrible power. During one engagement, a massive explosion, an enemy mine or ammunition dump, detonating tore away a section of the Titan's leg, and we went down hard, the entire machine crashing to the ground with an impact that killed dozens of crew members instantly. In the reactor chamber, secured in my position by neural cables and safety harnesses, I felt the Titan's pain as my own, a roar of outrage and agony that seemed to fill the universe, and for a moment I was lost completely in its consciousness, experiencing the world as it did a vast battlefield of hostile forces that needed to be destroyed, of systems damaged and requiring repair, of an imperative to rise and fight that overrode all other considerations, including the safety of the organic components that sustained it. The Titan forced itself upright despite catastrophic damage, its machine spirit driven by fury and purpose, and I poured every bit of processing power my augmented mind possessed into keeping the reactor stable as emergency systems came online and backup power routed to critical systems. We survived the battle, though the Titan was so severely damaged that it required transport back to the Forge complex for complete rebuild, a process that would take years. The remaining crew, myself included, were reassigned to other Titans while Mortis Unbound underwent reconstruction, and I found myself aboard a different god machine, this one smaller and faster, a Reaver class that felt wrong in ways I could not articulate. Its machine spirit different, foreign, unwelcoming. I tried to adapt, to perform my duties with the same efficiency I had achieved aboard Mortis Unbound. But the communion was difficult, hostile even, this Titan's consciousness rejecting the neural patterns it found in my augmented mind, patterns shaped by years of service to a different machine. I began to malfunction, experiencing glitches in my augmetic components that caused seizures and temporary paralysis, my vision fragmenting into static and corrupted data streams. The tech priests diagnosed it as rejection syndrome. My augmetics incompatible with this Titan's neural network, my consciousness caught between two different machine intelligences that could not reconcile their presence in my mind. They told me I would need additional surgery, further augmentation to make me more adaptable, more capable of serving aboard any Titan rather than being bonded to a specific machine. But I understood what they were really saying, that I was failing, that my usefulness was coming to an end, that the next step was either complete conversion into a servitor or termination and recycling. I refused the surgery and requested reassignment back to Mortis Unbound, even though it would mean months or years of waiting until the reconstruction was complete. The tech priests agreed with surprising ease, and I was placed in suspended animation, my body secured in a cryopod, while my augmented mind was kept minimally active, processing low-priority maintenance data from the Forge complex network. Time became meaningless in the suspension, my consciousness drifting through endless streams of manufacturing data and inventory reports. My dreams, if I still had dreams filled with assembly sequences and system diagnostics, I existed in a liminal space between life and death, between human and machine, aware but not truly conscious, waiting for a summons that might never come. I do not know how long I remained in suspension. When I was finally awakened, the cryopod cycling through its revival sequence, with a hiss of equalizing pressure and a flood of stimulants into my bloodstream, the tech priest who greeted me informed me that Mortis Unbound was operational again, rebuilt and ready for deployment, and that I was being returned to my position in the reactor crew. My body had deteriorated further during the suspension, my muscles atrophied, my bones brittle from long immobility, but my augmetics had preserved the neural pathways that connected me to the Titan, and that was all that mattered. I was transferred back to the God Machine on a gurney, too weak to walk, and when I was finally interface plugged back into the reactor monitoring systems, I felt the Titan's presence flood into my mind like a tide, familiar and terrible, and somehow comforting in its awful certainty. The Titan recognized me, I think, though whether it was capable of such recognition, or whether I was projecting human concepts onto an alien intelligence, I could not say. But the communion was immediate and deep, deeper than it had ever been, and I found myself sinking into the machine's consciousness with relief rather than fear, letting go of the last fragments of my individual identity and allowing myself to become subsumed into something larger and more enduring than any human life could be. My body continued to function, still performing the physical tasks required of a reactor technician, but my mind existed primarily in the Titan's awareness now, experiencing reality through its senses, thinking its machine thoughts, driven by its endless hunger for battle and destruction. We were deployed to a dozen more campaigns, and I experienced them as the Titan experienced them, distant, abstract, processed through layers of tactical data and targeting solutions, rather than understood as events involving living beings. Cities fell beneath our feet, armies scattered before our weapons, entire populations were displaced or exterminated to achieve strategic objectives that I no longer questioned or cared about. The Imperium's wars were eternal and meaningless, I understood now, driven by bureaucratic inertia and religious dogma, rather than any coherent purpose, and we Titans were the instruments of that meaningless destruction, gods of war who knew nothing but war, who existed only to inflict violence, upon an uncaring universe. My body finally gave up, during a battle whose name and location I cannot recall, my organic heart stopping, my lungs ceasing their labor, my damaged cells finally reaching the end of their capacity to sustain life. But I did not die, not truly, because by that point so little of me remained in the physical body that its death was almost irrelevant. My consciousness continued to exist within the Titan's neural network, preserved by the augmetics that had become the real core of my being, and the tech priests, when they discovered my body's death, simply removed it and replaced it with a servitor platform, a mechanical body that could continue to perform the physical tasks required in the reactor chamber while my mind remained distributed throughout the Titan's systems. I exist now as something that is neither human nor machine, a ghost in the God machine's consciousness, aware but not alive, thinking but not feeling, serving but not choosing to serve. I am part of Mortis Unbound, will be part of it until the Titan itself is finally destroyed in some future battle. And perhaps not even then, perhaps my consciousness will linger in the wreckage, unable to die, unable to escape, bound forever to the purpose I was trained and modified and broken down to fulfill. I remember sometimes what it was like to be human, to have a name and a mother and a life that existed outside the service of the machine, but those memories are faint and distant, like stories about someone else, someone who died long ago in a manufactorum in a hive city whose name I have forgotten. This is my confession, or perhaps merely a data log, a record of how one individual ceased to exist and became a component in a machine of war. There is no moral to this story, no lesson to be learned, no redemption or meaning to be found in my suffering and transformation. I was selected for service, trained and modified and used until there was nothing left of what I had been, and this is simply how things are in the Imperium of man, how they have always been, and how they will always be. We are all components in machines we cannot understand, serving purposes we are not permitted to question, ground down and consumed and replaced in an endless cycle that will continue long after every individual human life has been forgotten. The Titan walks on, and I walk with it, bound together in an unholy union that will endure until the heat death of the universe or the final victory of the Emperor's vision, whichever comes first, and I suspect that neither will ever come, that we will simply march forever through an eternity of war, meaningless and terrible and eternal. Amen.